This week on Literature Geeks,
we're going to explore the morality and messages behind All My Sons by Arthur Miller. I'm your host, Desiree Glynn.
And I'm your host, Katie Healy. To further develop our understanding of All My Sons, we reached out to Miss Kunji-Ray. She is an amazing actress and has played the role of Kate Keller, the mother in All My Sons.
Let's begin!
Thank you for reaching out. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I don't know. I thought we were really inspired by how you were holding yourself at the play. You can tell that you're very, professional.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
What was, may I ask what, I guess you guys have all these questions for me, but I'm quite curious about some of your perspectives too. So, it's interesting to hear the way that it's interpreted, because I've heard people talk about other people that they've seen do it and their impressions of the changes that I made. And it's interesting because to me they're very obvious, because there's things that are written in the script that, not just the actual lines, but some of the stage directions were just little tidbits of character traits, and people, I guess, have played it much more coldly than I did. So I'm just curious if, when you guys read it, if it felt like, the way that I approached her resonated with your vision of her.
Yeah, definitely.
And if the way that, yeah, go ahead.
I feel like when we read it that, you could feel like there was almost so much tension between Joe and Kate. You couldn't see their relationship at all in, a marital way almost. I just saw them more as, prisoners in a relationship than, in a physical, happy marriage to me. Yeah. What did you think, Desiree?
I felt like, with,
sorry.
With, their son, right?
Yeah, their son.
Their son, in their relationship, and they were, separated because of everything that was going on, and, it was more harshly in, the book than actually on stage.
Or even compared, we watched a couple tidbits from, a couple other plays while we were reading it, so we could get more of the vibe, and I felt like those actresses were almost being a little too literal with, their emotions, whereas you took it more in, a realistic way, I felt like. Yeah. You acted like someone who was actually grieving, whereas they took it and they almost, overacted the parts, I felt like.
Mm-hmm. That's super interesting, yeah, and, but when you were reading it, you felt like she was harsher also?
Yeah, I feel like they were definitely harsher. Whereas I feel like you played it in more of, a feminine way, just, sweet and, just definitely, a grieving mother rather than, someone angry at the world.
Yeah, and, a true family.
Awesome. I really appreciate that feedback. Yeah, that's how I perceived her. And I thought, it's tough because it was written in the late 40s, and it wasn't really a feminist era, except that I watched a couple of interviews. I don't know if you watched any interviews with Arthur Miller, but he actually said that he didn't realize it, or maybe when he wrote it, but then once he had it up and he was looking back at it and with some feedback, that he realized, and it feels funny because, I played this role, but he said, I actually feel like it's a play about Kate, that she's the central character. And to me, that made it make sense that she wasn't just a flat, kind of inhumane. I think the more emphasis put on a person as a character, the more depth they're going to naturally have, or was intended to be there. So I really felt like I needed to
Well, I can definitely see that, because, they played Joe, he's a tragic character in this, with the way he kills himself, he realizes his flaw, but at the end of the play, you can see that Kate realizes, her tragic flaw is, taking so much emphasis on, that Larry is alive, and, the last line, you can see, she just releases all of that tension that she built this whole time. You can take that, definitely, that she's, the tragic character in this.
Yeah, it was just an interesting perspective that he himself kind of came to the realization of, and not being necessarily a feminist or writing, not that it's a feminist play, but just that having a central character be this woman who is actually, I mean, she's pretty damn strong to hold her family, well, to attempt to hold her family together, I guess.
Yeah.
Failing miserably in the end, obviously, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the 40s are just
survival.
such a change. Like, just from the difference between, like, the 30s, you're going through his depression, the 40s, all the men are gone, and you're just working towards keeping that family while these men are gone, and then they're back, and you have to adjust your whole standings and your perspectives, and your son is broken, and your husband is overwhelmed, and here you are just making sure everyone's together, but at the same time, you've gone through so much as well.
After getting that background on how Miss Ray envisioned Kate's character, we dove into the dramatic ending of the play and asked her where she envisioned the character after and the impact of Kate's final line.
The last line that she has being, you asked where do I see the characters afterwards, and I feel like the last line kind of gives a lot of insight, which is that she's freeing her son, she's freeing Chris.
Mm-hmm.
She's giving him the okay to live again, which is what he wanted, right? I mean, that was what he asked for. Like, we're at a train station, and that train that never leaves. So she finally gives him the sort of motherly okay to go on and start living his life. And I guess I interpret that as her, so like what you just said, some amount of acceptance, I suppose, or it's just like a sigh of relief that now we can kind of move on, even if it's miserable and hard.
Yeah, I definitely see that.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from, and like the point of view that is really like,
it's just very like straightforward how all of a sudden like she's been just almost like broke, but broke for the better. Like she let go of that guilt she's been carrying for years.
Yeah.
Yes, that was exactly my that's how I took it. Yeah, I mean, yes, that's just true that, like, the truth will set you free, kind of.
Yeah, it's cliche, but cliches are there for a reason, obviously. Like, the truth will set you free. Like, so many people can relate to that.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. I mean, I feel like if you're holding on to this version of reality that takes so much effort and hiding and scheming and scamming and denying and fighting, and I mean, blah.
I know, you just grow so tired of it.
Yeah, painful, right?
Yeah, but it's almost like, at least in my eyes, that Annie kind of took on what Kate had let go. Because at the end of the play, Annie just becomes so, like, this desperate person. Like, she loses her confidence, I feel like, towards the end of the play.
Interesting. She loses her confidence. Because, well, she's unsure of really where she stands, because that's an interesting way of saying it. It does seem like that a bit. I don't know what you would think would be the driving force behind that loss of sort of confidence, but I mean, she's obviously unsure of what her reality is because it's all been shaken. Like, she's actually maybe in the midst of like where Kate is going to sum things up, and it will be a bit of a relief, like a pressure cooker has been popped open. But for Annie, it's almost like she has to reevaluate.
Yeah, that was a really good analogy.
Her whole existence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a really good analogy.
That's what it feels like, right? It's literally like this bang goes off, and it's like, okay, well, we can all breathe again. But yeah, I mean, Annie, she shunned her father all these years, and that's a big deal. You asked where they were afterwards, and I was thinking, like, she's got a lot of soul searching to do. I think she goes back to her father, and she has such a good heart and such a pureness about her that I feel confident that she would go back to her father and make amends. I mean, she didn't know. She was young. She was doing, and in some ways of the era, it makes sense, right? Because she's actually the most kind of, well, her and Chris together, these like upright, upstanding citizens that are, I mean, and Annie even more so, like this pure person who just wants to do the right thing, and that's why she shuns her father, because she can't imagine, being connected to somebody who's done that, and there's just no other way. And so now that she understands, it's not like Steve's not to blame, but that it's not, that he was sort of railroaded into it a bit.
Yeah,
can go back and have some relationship with him, I think, and apologize, and he can probably apologize. You know, and I feel like they can work on a relationship. I don't know about Chris and Annie, though.
Like, that's where I'm like,
George.
Chris and Annie, like, I feel like Chris and Annie were only ever wanting to be a thing because they knew no one else. It was almost like a desperate, like, just a cling for that reality prior to Larry disappearing. It's like they couldn't move past it. Maybe this was their way of coping with Larry's death.
That's interesting. I didn't, because I wasn't doing those roles, I didn't spend too much time unraveling them, but I think that's interesting. I would be an interesting way to play it, and I didn't really ask them much about their impressions either. Now I'm curious, because I think for me, I just was like, well, no, I mean, that's what they're going to do. I think in part because of the era and the way that people did do that. It was like people you know are the people that you feel close to, and that's who you marry. I mean, it's just so common to do that it didn't faze me too much, but, maybe... but who knows? Maybe after such a tragedy and after such a realization, maybe they couldn't find their way again. Because Chris says he's leaving and he's going alone, right? Like he wants to kind of deal with this on his own.
Well, do you think that's fair of Chris to keep denying that Joe was? So in Chris's mind, Joe is like perfect, right? And then, but he knows. Like, don't you believe that he knows deep down that Joe is made all these mistakes and Joe is really to blame?
Well, I mean, he does say, I always had a suspicion, and, and he blames his mom, you made me practical, and he does say I spit on myself because I let myself believe this even though I had a suspicion, so, yeah, that could be a serious rub between he and Annie also, because if he had a suspicion, but he never did anything about it, and I think in some version of this play, I think it was done maybe in the movie. I didn't ever watch the movie all the way through, to be honest. I kind of decided that the movie version wasn't, it's so different from the play. The script is basically the same, but everything is jumbled. It's not the same linearness as the play. I don't know if you guys watched it, but I guess that Chris goes to see Steve himself to figure out things. So, in a way, he's at least taking some proactive stance, where in the play, he's just sort of like a bystander. He doesn't really do anything terribly proactive.
Yeah, definitely. I think this would be a good time to bring up the class differences between, the Kellers and the Devers, and, their foils. Because...
Do you think, what makes you think their classes are different from one another?
Well, if you look at it, so... Kellers obviously came from a lower class, and they rose up into this upper class lifestyle, right? Where so did the Devers then, so they both were making about the same amount of money if they had this partner in it. But then the Devers would have lost everything, right? So the mother's disappeared, Annie's living by herself in New York, the father's in prison. So you can just see here's this family where they rose from just a regular lifestyle into this higher, more to lose almost. I feel like that when you do gain a lot, especially in this era, because this was the era of just got out of the Depression, capitalism's back. So it's just interesting to see how they rose, and then now they don't believe, Joe's beliefs are so different now, Prior to this, when he was poor, would he ever have let those planes go? Would Kate ever have let him stay home?
You wonder if before they had money, they would make the same choices? Is that what you said?
Mm-hmm.
Huh. Because they might have had a better ethical...
Yeah, they would have had a better moral compass before the money got involved, I think.
It's usually called a moral compass, and I called it an ethical barometer.
Ethical barometer? I think I'm going to start using that in my everyday life. That's better.
That's really funny. I'm like, that's not quite the saying. I mean, I know what it is, but it came out differently. So, let's see. That's interesting. I don't know if it changes their class, per se, because they were both in the same place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It changes maybe their I mean, I do think they kind of rose together. They probably came from the same stuff. They lived always, as far as I can tell, in that town.
House,
I mean,
yeah.
Maybe they moved into nicer houses or whatever. I think. I mean, it doesn't really say anything about where they came from, but I feel like of that time, you probably didn't go too far, especially if you end up a partner with somebody like they've known each other forever. Yeah, I don't know if it's so much a class thing between the two of them.
You can just really see
the
like how much they would have lost if Joe had decided that he would take the blame.
I think that they really are sort of the same. They come from the same cloth, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they grew together. And yes, obviously the Kellers would have lost everything like the Devers did. Well, I mean, they're not still gaining, right? So you're right, Annie, they're all working. And the mother, I don't know. I mean, they had the money they had. Would they have been given some of that? So,
it's just an interesting
you're right, Annie
idea.
talks about 3 weeks salary. I'm just trying to get the, like, class thing because it didn't really play much into my
your like thoughts behind characters.
interpretation. Just because I don't know how. I mean, I feel like it's a different thing from this era. It's so much more about things like ethics, and obviously that's a huge problem. But I don't know how much the haves and the haves and the have-nots. It wasn't as dramatic.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously the Kellers have a lot more money in there.
Yeah.
But is that really the same kind of priority?
Yeah, it's true.
So, I don't know. It's funny. I know it's not saying that it doesn't actually have a lot more to do with it than I gave it credibility for or whatever, but credence, but it didn't, it just didn't play into my thoughts so much. So what's the essence of the question? Because I'm sure there's a lot in there anyway. I don't mean to belabor it. It's just something I didn't quite grapple with too much. And even when I read the question, I was like, I'm not exactly sure what to say about that.
Like, I just feel like that coming from lower class and then, like, building this empire almost, it just makes him lose his morals. It made him, like, no longer see, like, life and death in the same light, you know what I mean? Or he made him it made Joe take such, like, a big risk, you know what I mean? And he didn't feel like it.
Because he had more to lose suddenly.
Yeah.
And he saw the potential,
Joe is so money hungry this entire play. Like, he always is so concerned about just the nickels and dimes rather than
Making
the actual, like, relationships between him and his son or him and his wife.
Right.
Like, he just keeps bringing up this big business that he's built for his family.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that once the pie is in the sky and you've got your eye on it, and it becomes like a possibility to grab onto it, that does. I do think you're right that changes your willingness to like do the right thing, or at least it changed his willingness to do the right thing. You know, like some people might not have been so easily like molded by potential money.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you're coming out of depression and everybody is striving to survive. I mean, it's really survival, right? So when I know, I mean, even people in my family, like my aunt's husband, he didn't do anything horrible like that, but he wanted to make sure his family had enough, and in doing so, he ended up blowing through pretty much all of their money in order to look like he was doing better than he was at work, and took out a mortgage on the house that his wife, my aunt, didn't know about. And when they went to sell it, they ended up with basically nothing, and it was a huge shock to the whole family. And he's was a very ethical person and very high standards for behavior. But even in that case, I think it was sort of a survivalist sort of desire, and also very masculine too.
Yeah.
To take care of my family.
Like, yeah, definitely.
And he was born in probably the late 30s, so he was sort of that era and the mindset too. So I don't know, is it more a masculine thing? And it is true. I mean, he says very clearly, like, was this war about war and peace, or was it about dollar and cents? That is his impression, but on the other hand, wars have notoriously been money machines.
Mm-hmm.
And people were sending people over with guns, and yes, he sent faulty shit, but I do believe him, and maybe it's not true, but I do believe that he thinks they would figure that they would see it, and they wouldn't put them in the plane. It might be a lie, but part of me feels like even if it's a lie, he was lying to himself.
Yeah, like he just couldn't handle thinking that they wouldn't have like, I understand that. I don't think that he's a bad person. I think that he's a good person who just made one bad decision.
Yeah.
And I mean, but then so did Steve. Steve did it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's true too.
They both kind of felt like guilt in a way for just what they did to the people.
To the people that ended up dying.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we don't get to hear much from Steve, but based on
what we get from Georgie, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, based on what we do get to hear from the kids talking about him, he seemed like a very good guy, but also a little bit weak, and yes, Joe took advantage of that. But on the other hand, he had a weakness that allowed him to make a shitty decision, so his moral compass wasn't as solid either, you know what I mean? Because he did other things in the past, yelling at Frank for giving him, blaming, and they all agree that these things happened, and he, somebody got fired because
didn't like the electrician got fired or something because of the heater.
yeah, exactly. Like, Joe comes in and somebody, almost died and the place burned down, and whose fault was it? And it actually was Steve's, but he allowed somebody else to take the fall for it. So it makes that relationship and who they really were as people, and also it puts the era in context of, like, who really was right. Keller was the one that had more, like, manipulative nature, but Steve also didn't have the strength to say no. And so those are, like, flaws in their characters.
Then we took a moment to reflect on the play in context to the world around us.
And it's so relative to the era, too, which is just super important. And obviously we've all come out of that time currently because it's our history, so it influences how we behave now, too.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's not an identical match to our, what we're going through.
Well, that's like the nice thing about literature is that it doesn't matter when you read it, the questions always remain relevant in some kind of way. Even if technology is different, or we wear different clothes, or have different lifestyles, the questions about, like, life just always kind of stay the same.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And they just have, even if the implications are slightly different, or the answers would be slightly different given the current context. Do you want to go and dive into another question?
Yeah.
So when Annie, like, gives you the letter that, that supposedly Larry wrote the day before he died, do you think that Kate believes that Larry is alive at that time?
Oh, you mean basically every minute up until that moment?
Yes.
What I kind of came to terms with is I think that she does have this sincere hope, because it is true that other people have come back after longer than Larry, so why would she not?
Yeah.
On the other hand, I'm sure that there's some part of her that thinks that he is dead. I mean, I think she's in a hopeful state, and it's sincere.
Yeah.
All the while thinking that he's more likely dead.
Yeah. Do you think it's more, like, hard to, like, her family, like, Kate's family, like, really believes that he's, dead, and, like, Kate has to believe in herself that, like, there's a possibility that he may be alive?
It kind of shows her strength.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, right, because everyone else is like, we think he's dead, right?
Yeah.
And she
still believes and, like, hopes that,
Yeah, I mean, she does, at the end, Joe says to her something like, well, that's the boy we lost, and he and I are in Act 3 sitting in the chairs, and I'm waiting for Chris, and Larry, that was the boy we lost, and I feel like I'm in agreement that we lost him. I'm not, but again, I don't know if it's 100% committed to him being dead, but then there's also the concept that if your brother, I say to Chris, if your brother is dead, then your father killed him, and God doesn't let that happen. I don't know. It's like I think she's upholding a facade, but I do think there's something sincere in it. I don't think that she's doing it just because she can't let her husband have killed her son. Maybe that's how it's written, and I think other people have a more kind of harsh attitude about it, but she believes in God. She's looking to, the horoscopes and I don't know if she's doing that just to play like she really believes. Yeah. The one thing that makes me question her sincerity in this is that she calls Frank a big dope. They say that big dope next door who's got 3 kids and a house paid off.
Yeah, that was a little weird, I thought, because... Sorry.
It is weird. I don't know if it's just sort of pointing out that he's goofy, because I think he is kind of goofy, but that's the one statement that makes me wonder about her, commitment to her belief. It's not anything else in the play, which is weird, and I don't even know if anybody else ever even paid attention to that, but I'm like, if she calls him that, does she really believe he's just dopey? So, I don't know. I never made a clear... what I played it as, I think, is that she really did have hope that he'd come back, or that he might, but also deep in her heart was sort of prepared for him to not ever come back. And the whole thing about if he's dead and your father killed him, to me, I was like, that is her really believing or wanting to believe that God wouldn't let that happen. And also that Keller she does feel like her husband did a horrible thing. She believes that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I agree, she definitely.
It's not,
she knew.
I think she really has a hard time with that. As much as she loves him and adores him, he is the cause of so much of their pain.
Yeah, so much
that's
sorrow.
Why I think there's so much tension. Mm-hmm.
And then he's even, at the end of it, the reason why Larry ended up disappearing.
Mm-hmm.
Deep down, he's the reason Larry ended up, I guess we can assume Larry killed himself.
Yeah, I think once she reads the letter, I don't think she has any, I think it's clear. I think that's it. Now she knows. And it's a fact. At that moment, I think it's, 3 years of being in a semi-state of denial and hopefulness, it just comes to a, crashing end. Yeah, and then that's why she's like, why take yourself to jail, because what's the point at this point?
You're never going to get anything out of you going to jail.
Yeah.
Well,
I do think her son Larry, she says, Larry would never tell you to do this. I think that's BS. I think Larry
was almost more strong-rooted in it than Chris, because Larry was willing to, just reading a newspaper article, decided, I'm going to kill myself over this. I think his beliefs in it were even stronger. Chris was only...
And Chris.
Yeah,
yep.
Chris would... Chris would never have taken it to an extreme like that.
Mm-hmm.
No, he wouldn't, because he had suspicion all the time, and he never did anything about it.
I definitely agree. All right, well, thank you so much for your time.
I really appreciate you guys reaching out. It's a big compliment, and thanks for diving in so much. It's really neat. You guys were an incredible audience. It was such a pleasure, because we're nervous school people.
Well, we were so into really seeing the live performance rather than the book. So it was very interesting the way you guys acted it out.
Oh, that means so much. I'll keep passing it along and sharing the enthusiasm. I think everyone got it because you guys were such a fabulous audience. But I'll make sure to put it out there again anyway. And yeah, I'm glad that you appreciated my take on it. It was, kind of ballsy to go against what most other people did.
Yeah, it was.
What are you going to do, right? You're up there, so you got to make the choices that work for you. And, you know, obviously that's part of my character, too. I want to see the humanity in people, which is why I think partly I played it that way. But if it had not been clear in the script, there was ambiguity and room for that sort of, I wouldn't have played it that way. But I really felt strongly that she's such a strong person and conflicted deeply and doesn't want to lose any more family, and it's just confusing. And so be human, right?
Yeah,
be a family.
definitely.
You made choices. You don't want to lose your people, so you just do whatever you can. And it's very much the nature of us.
That was some deep conversation into the meanings of All My Sons. I feel like now I have a true understanding of Kate's emotions and struggles. And I loved how we explored the context of the play and the era it was created.
I hope after listening you can walk away feeling a little more in tune with the world around you. Special thank you to Miss Ray for joining us. Thank you for listening, and see you next time on Literature Geeks.